talk a little bit more about resilience and then get further into mindfulness and its impact on resilience. Let's talk a bit about our neurobiology and our hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's is something that's been understood for a while. And what's key to understand here is that for our kiddos, it is difficult for them to actually achieve the desired behaviors in a classroom or in a school-based setting if their basic needs aren't being met. And if we are to be an investigator or detective, one of the things we have to understand is that if the kiddos we're working with do not have many of their physiologic needs met, food, water, shelter, sleep, it is going to be almost impossible for them to actually move further up in terms of their emotional intelligence and in terms of their behavior management. And what is also true is that part of basic needs is safety and security. And those are things that if they do not have them, do not have safety, do not have security, whether it's at home, whether it's at school, or in a number of other settings, they are going to be experiencing a higher level of stress. Those are things that are actually classified as ACEs. Those are things that can actually cultivate trauma for them if it's happening repeatedly. So the lack of physiologic needs, the lack of safety are all things that can actually contribute to pretty high levels of stress for the kiddos that we're working with and actually can become potentially traumatic. And really that keeps them at, relative to this hierarchy or pyramid on the lower level of their emotional development. It's going to be difficult for them to actually achieve what we need them to achieve from a cognitive, academic, and learning standpoint, and certainly even from a behavioral standpoint if their basic needs aren't being met. And what we understand now, understanding neurobiology and ACEs and trauma, we know that the lack of these needs, or at least the scarcity of in terms of these needs being met, means that they are going to be experiencing potentially more stress and potentially more trauma, and it's going to make it so that the front part of their brain is having difficulty working optimally and allowing them to pay attention, stay on task, stay organized, stay in their seat, and potentially be less disruptive or not disruptive at all in the classroom. So in order to actually even start to think about resilience, the thing that could potentially counteract trauma or whether something is traumatic, those basic needs have to be met. So in order for us to be trauma-informed educators, we also have to be looking at whether or not these basic needs are being met. Because without them, it's very difficult for kids to be resilient, very difficult for any of us to be resilient. And resilience is that thing that helps us counteract trauma. So here's another way to look at resilience and different ways to understand it. So resilient capacity and the extent to which individuals develop this capacity results from interactions with societal, community, family, individual, physiologic, and cellular factors across the life course. So there are a lot of factors in how we actually become resilient. So let's backtrack a bit and even think about what is resilience. Resilience is not necessarily the lack of stress or the inability, or I should say the ability to not feel stress, or even the lack of trauma. Resilience is the thing that helps us mitigate stress and mitigate trauma. Ultimately, the more years we live and the more experiences we have, we will experience stress. And many of us over time will experience trauma because those stresses are either repeated or become incredibly severe, even if it's a one-time stressor, say like an intense grief. Resilience is something that we can also develop, we can build. It's not something that you're just given at birth and that's all you got. It is something that we can cultivate, and that is true for adults and that's true for kids as well. So there are ways that we can actually do this work together as educators and adults in kids' lives, is that we can actually all cultivate resilience together. But a big piece of being able to cultivate resilience is the acknowledgement that stressors happen, trauma happens, and we can cultivate resilience alongside stressors and trauma happening in our lives. You don't have to have an absence of stress or trauma to be able to cultivate resilience, that you can have all of those experiences sitting side by side. And the same is true for the kiddos that we're seeing in our classrooms and for their behaviors, that they can experience those behaviors, they can experience their stress and their trauma, and they can also cultivate resilience alongside that, and we can help them. So one of the major ways that has been studied is mindfulness and its direct correlation with resilience. So we'll talk about that from a neurobiologic chemical standpoint. Right now, we'll watch this video.
When I do a mindful activity, it feels very quiet and calming and centered, like I'm the only person in the room.
Schools are places where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of dysregulated nervous systems.
When they come in the morning, we do mindful practice, and sometimes they come upset or tired, but they know that they can find calmness in their breathing. It helps them to focus.
Sometimes, like when people bother me a lot, I'll be like a less calm student, like have a lot of anger.
What if we just created a space where we could take a moment to really come back to what's most important?
Mindfulness is like where you go to a quiet space and focus on your breath and what's around you. It's like for another way to cool down when you're mad. When I can't figure out the answer to a question on a test, I get really stressed sometimes, but then I stop and then I notice what I'm doing.
That pause impacts our well-being, but it impacts how we react and respond.
I say, okay, right now I'm feeling very angry. I need to calm down. And then I say, I can do this if I review it one time. Maybe I just need to count down from 10.
To move towards these 21st century skills, there's so many foundational pieces that help those things happen. While we're breathing in and breathing out, if our mind starts to wander till lunch or thinking about other things, and as soon as we realize we're thinking, we can come right back. It's like we're getting our minds ready to just stay right where we are.
My mind is like, it wandered off to like a place that's calm and peaceful.
Oh wow, how did that feel?
It felt great.
It's a way for us to approach supporting children's social emotional development. Kids need to be taught skills really intentionally. Mindfulness has helped me just kind of slow it down a little bit and just be really present for parents and for students, acknowledging teachers' needs.
Teachers have a lot of stress. Mindfulness had helped my practice and become a better teacher, having the calmness that the kids need to solve their problems, to being able to learn better.
By starting with the adults in the community, we're helping the whole community. It impacts our ability to listen and to relate to other people and have empathy, build resilience and confidence in kids, which is so powerful.
When I do mindfulness, I feel calm and I have confidence.
When I do mindfulness, I feel calm and steady.
If everyone in the world practiced mindfulness, it would be more peaceful and they wouldn't be as afraid to express themselves and tell themselves to calm down. If everybody used it, there wouldn't be as much problems.
So let's think a little bit about mindfulness and reactivity and start to understand how mindfulness impacts resilience. So resilience is made up of a lot of different behaviors. It is our ability to continue to execute tasks, so to have the front part of our brain keep working despite the amount of stressors and trauma we might have experienced in our life. It's not necessarily the absence of stress, as I mentioned. It's not the absence of depression or anxiety or even chronic health concerns. It's the ability to keep showing up, tending to tasks, living, for both kiddos and adults alike, in the face of those stressors and trauma. So mindfulness is one of those things that can actually help to address our reactivity, which is sometimes, very often, for both kids and adults alike, the way that our stress and trauma shows up is our response time. So you may have seen this with kiddos in school-based settings, is that they potentially are shorter fused or more agitated and more easily thrown off course, which we understand as maybe potentially having difficulties with attention or hyperactivity. Both are potentially related to this concept or this phenomenon of reactivity. And mindfulness is one of the things that can actually shift our level of reactivity and our reaction time and our reaction severity or intensity. So here's an illustration on this slide about how mindfulness affects reactivity. And the way that this could potentially impact us in the classroom is that with mindfulness being brought to the classroom or to a child's experience, it doesn't change the fact that the stress is happening. The stressor could still be happening in the classroom, whether it's the noises and movements of other students, whether it's their own hunger and lack of sleep. But the mindfulness, what it does is can slow the reaction or the response time. The same is true for us as adults and educators. That a child's behavior that we're seeing in the classroom, and maybe it's the afternoon, and maybe this is a kiddo who's had these behaviors every single day for the last couple of weeks, that's a stimulus for us. And what mindfulness can do for us as the adults and the educators is also have us take a pause and shift our reaction to a response, which is a subtle distinction, but really important in terms of how that we treat that person, the younger child that's in our classroom or school-based setting, and then how they are then stressed and or traumatized by our reaction or our response in that situation. How we may be compounding or alleviating the amount of stress or trauma that that child might be experiencing. So mindfulness and reactivity isn't just about shifting the attentiveness or the hyperactivity of the kiddos. It also has a really important effect for us as the educators and the teachers to effectively slow or pause or attenuate our reaction time and create a more thoughtful response, a more mindful response. So take a minute or so to think of an experience you've had in the classroom or anywhere else, and a way that you acted that you later regretted. Maybe you processed it with another educator or an administrator. And try to think about that situation using the language of the slide. That the student's behavior wasn't the student being any number of adjectives. The student wasn't there to ruin your life or disrupt your classroom or to create any trauma for you or stress for you, but that the student itself and their behaviors was a stimulus, objectively. And your reaction was what? And if we could have acted more mindfully or thoughtfully or hit the pause button in that time, how could we have changed our reaction to a response? That is ultimately what mindfulness is. Mindfulness isn't necessarily sitting on a mountaintop and meditating for 2 hours every single day. Mindfulness is really about interjecting that pause or that brief moment to be thoughtful about how what's happening isn't necessarily about us or to us. It is a stimulus, and we can change the way that we respond from a reaction to a thoughtful response. So mindfulness, what does it do biochemically? It actually affects big portions of the brain that are also being affected or active when we see behaviors in the classroom that we want to manage. So there is an amazing amount of overlap in terms of what mindfulness does to the very specific areas of the brain that are discharging the chemicals that are then creating an internal brew for these kiddos that might make it difficult for them to be attentive or compliant or stay in their chairs or not poking other students in the classroom. So you can see from this diagram that it actually affects a lot of the same portions of the brain that we looked at earlier in our section on neurobiology. It affects the front part of the brain that's associated with regulating emotions, behaviors, making choices, and wise or better decisions. And it affects the middle part of the brain, that amygdala, and the part of the brain that is starting the cascade of chemicals that initiates that stress response that happens all throughout the body. So mindfulness and utilizing some of the techniques of mindfulness from that video and some other things that we'll look at as we go further are ways that we can practice, not perfect, retraining the response from the middle part of the brain to the front part of the brain and the rest of the body from a reaction to a more thoughtful response. So what does it look like if we are able to incorporate mindfulness into education? And again, this is the practice of mindfulness, not the perfection. That simply incorporating mindfulness into our classrooms, even if we are just starting out and even if we don't consider ourselves experts in mindfulness, you certainly don't have to be, has benefits. That simply even engaging in this practice a few minutes a day, a few hours a week, actually shifts and creates all of these potential benefits in the classroom. And there's benefits for educators and students alike. So incorporating mindfulness isn't just about bringing it into the classroom to change the behaviors of the students. It also really works to help shift our responses and our ways of thinking about what we're seeing in our students and in the classroom. So benefits for us as educators: reduce stress and burnout, more enjoyment of our jobs and greater efficacy in our jobs, creating actually more emotionally supportive classrooms. And when we say emotionally supportive, we're also thinking more trauma-informed classrooms, better classroom organization, the need for less disciplinary action, and thinking about not just in that moment what a disciplinary action does for that student experiencing it, for all the other students witnessing it, because we know as educators that when we are disciplining a student, it is never without the eyes of the other 18 or 25 students who are there, and the ears of those same students listening and observing our response to that student's behavior. They are also learning from that interaction as well. And having less disciplinary action in the classroom also helps to attenuate that response for all of them, even if they are quote-unquote in compliance. It also allows us to develop more trust and relationship with students. If we are not necessarily always engaged in an adversarial or disciplinary interaction with students, we have the ability to actually build positive relationships with them that actually involve trust and relationship, such that if we ever get into a situation where we have to rely on a management plan, we can create a management plan because we've actually developed a relationship with that kiddo. In addition to benefits for us as educators, there's numerous benefits for students just simply by agreeing to initiate and engage in the practice of mindfulness, not necessarily in perfecting it. So there's actually demonstrable effects in terms of their attention and learning skills, social emotional skills, and certainly their level of resilience. And the way that we're defining resilience for students here is not necessarily the lack of anxiety or stress or trauma or depression, but the reduction in all of those experiences. And mindfulness is accessible. So I want you to think for a moment as an educator, a teacher in a classroom or in any other school-based setting, and think about how many minutes in a day get dedicated towards a disciplinary action. So any of those scenarios we've discussed in the other sections prior to now, or even in your own experience, think of a kiddo who's been routinely disruptive in your classroom. We've all had that experience at least once, maybe numerous times. And think about how many minutes is spent. Most kids will reflect back that they know when those situations are happening. They're going to sit tight for a few minutes while that situation gets resolved. They're all watching and listening. So the classroom flow already stops just simply to manage that situation or that behavior of that one student. What could it look like in a trauma-informed classroom, in a classroom engaged in the practice of mindfulness, to take those same 3, 7, 12 minutes that were dedicated towards engaging in a disciplinary action for certain behaviors to then engage in a mindfulness activity? There are obviously certain situations where this isn't possible, where personal safety is involved, and there's obviously other concerns that have to come first, either of the kiddo themselves or maybe if they're harming other people. But in a situation where the behavior is being managed within the classroom, what would it be like to invite this person, this kiddo who you're experiencing behavioral challenges with, into an activity with the other students? To not engage in an exclusionary disciplinary action, but rather to use it as an opportunity for everybody to check with where they are emotionally, physically in that moment. And that includes us. So here's an example here on the side of what's considered a 3-minute body scan. There's any number of techniques that we can utilize. Another example is what we call box breathing, and simply having kids pull out a piece of paper, trace a box on there, and literally follow that box along with their fingers as they breathe in and out. And we can do that together. And these are things that take about 3 minutes. Ultimately, they're also free. So they don't necessarily require additional apps. They don't necessarily impair school district budgets. It's something that schools with more resources or less resources can engage in. These are all things that also from an equity standpoint and being equity-facing or equity-focused educators, we can actually incorporate into the classroom because they don't require anything more than the time that we are already spending engaged in a disciplinary action. And this is for us too, as the adults and the educators in these kiddos' lives. These mindfulness activities are something that we're doing together. And we're also modeling for them that these are things that we continue doing throughout our lives. This isn't something that you're just doing because you're a kid in my classroom. This is something that you do as your life's work. There are a number of ways for us to incorporate this into algorithms or thinking trees. So this is an example of a thinking tree and what kind of thinking you could engage in as a situation is arising in your classroom. Again, there are moments where personal safety is a risk, and there is room for that on a thinking tree or algorithm like this, that you first have to address that according to school policies. But assuming that everyone in that situation is safe, what can we do next? Well, we can take a deep breath and choose how to respond. Because ultimately, as the adults or the educators, we do have that choice. And here, I'll make a distinction. We can choose how we are going to respond, or we can choose how we are going to react. So coming back to the slide about how mindfulness is the thing that creates that pause or that slowdown to create a response versus a reaction. And using something or a way of thinking like this is where then we can build in all of our different techniques, whether it's a 3-minute body scan, or whether it's box breathing, or whether it is simply sitting quietly and drawing or writing. And all of the students and the teacher together actually engage in that mindfulness activity as a team. There are any number of mindfulness resources that are out there. I listed a few here on this slide that have activities that you can incorporate today into your classroom and practice with. Mindfulness is a practice. People who are dedicated meditators, who have been engaged in mindfulness work their whole lives or their careers, they are practitioners. They are not experts, they are not perfectionists, and neither are any of us. And most people who find themselves going down the path of mindfulness work realize that they are more and more humble and more uncertain about what they're doing with mindfulness work as they actually, quote unquote, get better at it. And that is really the irony of being a practitioner of mindfulness techniques, is that, and as an educator, is that it's, you will, as you learn more, you will learn more about what you don't know. But that there are endless amount of techniques that you can actually incorporate into the classroom that are designed for teachers, and many of those are listed here. And now we'll take a quick moment to watch this video.
What inspired you to begin a mindfulness program for the youth?
Well, I myself am a practitioner, and I've seen how mindfulness practice has transformed my life, seeing how it's made my life so much more joyful and meaningful. How could I not bring it to my students?
Hi, my name is Meena Srinivasan, and I've been a classroom teacher for more than a decade in Brazil, India, and California. And I currently work for the Oakland Unified School District's Social Emotional Learning and Leadership team. Teaching is a sacred task. As educators, we're dedicated to making the world a better place. Mindfulness is a powerful means to that end. Mindfulness is a kind, curious, compassionate awareness that we can bring to the present moment. A mindful classroom creates conditions for learning. Oftentimes before class, I tell my students, okay, your bodies are here, but where are your minds? Are your minds still at lunch? Still in your last class? And so we would invite the bell, because what the bell does is it helps us practice mindful breathing. And that connects our bodies and our minds and establishes us in the present moment.
I like the mind connected to the body method the most because we do it almost every day before classes, and I think it really helps with schoolwork and focusing in class.
I find that it really helps us, the whole class, to calm down, and I feel like we're a lot more peaceful.
I wrote Teach, Breathe, Learn to show how mindfulness can be incorporated into any teacher's routine. Complete with lesson plans, there are step-by-step instructions for how to teach mindfulness to young people. This book is really just an offering of my heart, and my hope is that it will provide you with the tools, resources, and inspiration to bring mindfulness into your life, both in and outside the classroom.
What are your next steps? So beyond the behaviors that are in the classrooms, there are kiddos that you will have in your classroom who have known diagnoses, who have educational plans. One of the things that we will build upon next in the subsequent chapters is to understand the biochemical, neurobiologic profile of the kiddo that you are working with who has a known diagnosis and a care plan, and how you can utilize some of what we've talked about today in terms of ACEs, trauma, social dimensions of health, and mindfulness in working with kiddos who have known diagnoses and care plans. We'll talk more about social dimensions of health and specifically how housing, family dynamics, food, sleep, and overall eating patterns can affect school behavior and what you're seeing in the classroom. And then finally, we'll talk a lot more about systemic factors. So what are the school policies, district policies, and even state legislative policies that affect what you're able to do in a classroom and how you're able to actually shift the behaviors, but also shift your approach and the culture of your own classroom. Thank you very much for your time today, and that wraps up our discussion on mental and behavioral health in the K-3 elementary age population.